evening. Welcome to Japan Society. I'm Moto Sakurai, President of Japan Society. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the lecture with Mr. Bremmer, the President of Eurasia Group. Today, Mr. Bremmer will talk about the latest book, US versus Them, The Failure of Globalism. Before we begin, we'd like to thank each of the sponsors that make these business and policy programs possible. Global leaders, Citigroup, Deloitte, and the United Airlines, and the corporate partners, Mizuho Financial Group, and Toyota Motor North America. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presider, Ms. Catherine Kobayashi. Kobayashi is coming. Ms. Kobayashi is the anchor and the reporter for NHK World, the international division of Japan's largest network, NHK. Ms. Kobayashi has reported on special events such as the inauguration of President Trump in Washington, D.C. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Kobayashi-san.
Well, I have this, so I guess this doesn't matter. My name is Catherine Kobayashi. Thank you all for coming in the snow. We're supposed to have a full house tonight. I think some people are late because of the weather. But for all of you, thank you so much for coming. I know it's a slippery slope out there. And no wonder we have a full house tonight because our special guest is very famous globally, and he told me just earlier that he's very well known in Japan, as you all know. And he told me a little story, which I thought was very funny. Only 5 minutes ago, he was staying at a hotel. Can I say the name of the hotel? Well, maybe not. The Peninsula in Tokyo. And just for fun, he, on social media, said, hey, I'm going to go jogging tomorrow at 6 a.m. Who wants to join me? And 10 people showed up. And they went jogging around the Imperial Palace. How amazing. So it is no wonder that tonight 260 people signed up for the event. So thank you all for coming. Now, without further ado, let's get right into it. In the last few years, as we all know, protectionist-driven political campaigns and policies have gained popularity in countries like the US, Britain, and France. Globalism, on the other hand, has maybe more detractors than supporters these days. Does that mean globalism has failed the world's citizens? To answer that question and more, we have a very special guest, as you know. He needs no introduction, but just to recap, Mr. Bremmer is the president and founder of Eurasia Group, the leading global political risk research and consulting firm. He has been dubbed as the rising guru in the field of political risk by The Economist. And he's a foreign affairs columnist and editor-at-large for Time magazine. He is the author of 10 books. His latest book, Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism, is a New York Times bestseller. Many have read his work and watched his countless interviews on TV, but for those of us who are here in the flesh, we get to see him, or who are here. Oh, I practiced this 100 times. For those of us who are here, we get to see him in the flesh. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ian Bremmer.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Nice to be back, Sakurai-san. 15 years we've been friends. Not the first time I've been in Japan Society. It's always great to be here. Kobayashi-san, thank you very much for those kind words. I am going to correct you, though you didn't know. But I was not staying at the Peninsula Hotel. No. I asked them to meet me in front of the Peninsula Hotel because just in case there were any wacko stalkers, I did not want them meeting me at the Imperial Hotel and then following me around inside. I'm like, I thought it would be safer for just to say, let's meet someplace else. Just, who knows. And I will talk about my book a little bit, but I'm not going to just talk about my book because a lot is going on. Right? I mean, I got to talk about the Vietnam summit and Trump and Kim Jong-un. Got to talk about U.S.-China relations a little bit, right? And the trade relationship and coming up March 1, what are we doing on tariffs? just came back from Munich from the security conference where Vice President Pence, sort of gave his speech and crickets. So a little bit of that is worthwhile too, right? So I'll do all that. But I'll start off because you asked me to come and talk about my book, and I'm certainly going to, follow directions in Japan. That's a smart thing to do. Let me give you a few moments on the book. First point, the failure of globalism. Do I believe globalism has really failed? Yes. Yes, I do. Now, I need to make the distinction between globalism and globalization. Globalization is the movement of goods and services and ideas and people and data faster and faster around the world with very little regard for state boundaries, and that has been a success, an extraordinary success. 1 billion people out of extreme poverty just in the last generation. Never in humanity have we achieved so much in the planet. That's great. How can you not be a fan of globalization, right? Globalism is the idea propagated by Western elites and leaders, people that go to Davos, right? The idea that supporting comparatively open borders and free trade and America and its allies acting to provide collective security globally, that is a wise thing for all the citizens inside the advanced industrial democracies to do. That is a support of globalism. And let's be very clear, that's failed. That large numbers of people inside all of these advanced democracies, with one important exception, which I will get to, large numbers feel like they've been lied to, like the system's rigged, right? Failure of globalism. You told us, and when I say you, I'm not just talking about political leaders in the establishment. I'm talking about the mainstream media. I'm talking about CEOs of corporations. I'm talking about the bankers. I'm even talking about public intellectuals like myself. So there's complicity here, right? That all of these people have been promoting an agenda that says, if you guys get on board with more immigration and more free trade and the Americans doing, sort of making the world safer democracy, that it's going to be good for you. And, all you have to look at, you look at Brexit, and you look at Trump, and you look at Bernie Sanders, you look at AOC, you look at Howard Schultz, and how that flopped. You look at the Gilets jaunes in France, the yellow vests. You look at the Italian government today. You look at Viktor Orban in Hungary. You even look at some emerging markets like Mr. Bolsonaro in Brazil and Lopez Obrador in Mexico, and you realize that there are large numbers of people that just believe that the establishment is fundamentally lying to them. I mean, this sort of started in a big way with Brexit 2.5 years ago. And let's be clear, they didn't really know what they were voting for. I mean, even the people that led Brexit didn't really have a plan, right? But they did know that they were voting against a whole bunch of people that had great education and money and influence and a lot of fancy facts, but they had a fundamental truth that was broader than that, the people that voted for Brexit, which is they knew these people did not have their interests at heart, no matter what they said. They weren't making their lives better. That the social contract, or here in the United States, the idea of the American dream, is not something that was being made good on. And so in that regard, globalism has failed. And I think that's a pretty indicting thing to talk about, right? Now, if you want to ask why has it failed, in the book I talk about 4 very disparate reasons. One, the pure economic, the massive social inequality. In the United States, we now have greater inequality than at any point since before the Great Depression, the Gilded Age, right? And, President Hoover, the last one to try hands-off, private sector, business elites, they'll take care of this, we just need to support more philanthropy, did not move the needle. Then FDR comes in, there's a New Deal, right? But since then, right, we've never seen inequality like what we had at that point. And an awful lot of Americans in the working and middle class feel like that's hollowed out and their opportunities aren't there. And people haven't invested in the infrastructure and the education that would give them the opportunity for their children to live better than their forebears have. This is obviously something we see a lot of in European states as well, other places too. That's one big driver. A second big driver is the backlash to immigration. If you are not investing in your middle and working class, then why are we going to allow a whole bunch of new people in? Why would we support that? And as you see, Merkel, for example, generally speaking, there's reasonable support for economic policies in Germany, but very strong opposition, real animosity when they allowed 1 million Syrian refugees in. And that's, in fact, part of the reason, maybe the biggest part of the reason, why Merkel was forced to resign her chairmanship of the Christian Democrats. And I just saw her give her last speech at the Munich Security Conference the last couple of days. France, massive, anti-immigrant sentiment. You probably see that there's enormous amounts of anti-Muslim sentiment in France. Now, some of this is based on lack of integration of these Muslims into French society and the way they think of their nation, which is much more about you better speak the language fluently, not have an accent, you better understand French culture. Part of it is that the French just have bad ideas of what's happening in immigration. There are 7% of France is Muslim, but if you ask the French what percent they think of the population is Muslim, they say about a third. I don't know where they keep all these Muslims, I don't know where they hide them, but they do say that, right? And frankly, you go to Hungary, you go to Canada, you go to the United States, all of these countries believe that there are a lot more Muslims in the country than actually is true. That's second reason, anti-immigration. Third reason, against the wars, right? What do I mean by against the wars? Well, if you looked at the communities in the United States that were around military bases, the enlisted men and women and their families and the people that are extended to them, you didn't have anyone voting for Jeb or for Hillary. These were people voting for Trump and for Bernie. Why? Because the foreign policy establishment has for a long time supported these international interventions. Remember that when you talk about the Never Trump movement, on domestic policies, that is an independent and Democrat movement. It's not Republicans. 92% of people that identify as Republican support Trump. It's the highest percentage of any party for their own president 2 1/3 years into the presidency since George Bush after 9/11, who was also 92, 93, right? So that's very high. But on foreign policy, the Never Trump movement was the entire foreign policy establishment, Dems and Republicans. They all hated him. Why? Well, in part, because Trump was talking about ending all these wars, right? That's interesting. And indeed, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and interventions in Libya and Syria and a bunch of other places around the world, Vietnam historically, certainly have been fought and in many cases lost on the back of the disenfranchised, on the back of the poor. And they're pretty angry about it. And they'd like that to stop. And so that's a third reason, and not just the United States, but also American allies that have sent a lot of people to war. I was with the Georgian Prime Minister a couple days ago. They have 1,000 people in Afghanistan, Georgia. It's the highest per capita intervention of any of the American allies around the world into Afghanistan. And while the Americans are now saying they don't want to keep 2,000 troops on the ground in Syria, special forces, the Georgians are trying mightily to make the argument that they need to keep their 1,000 in Afghanistan because, of course, they desperately want to get into NATO, which will never happen, but nonetheless, they want to be credible around it. That's the third reason. Fourth reason, technology. We've seen how NAFTA and free trade with China has led to some jobs being outsourced from developed countries with more expensive labor into cheaper labor force countries. But with the advance of technology, we see that far more jobs are being displaced, far more jobs are being gigified into smaller components where you don't need to give people things like long-term job security and benefits. That is happening much quicker, much more broadly as well. Also technology, the fact that we now consume information mostly on social media, especially young people, and we only follow what we like, which means very narrow polarization of politics inside all these countries. So when you add these four things up, the economic disenfranchisement, the anti-immigration backlash, the anti-military intervention backlash, and the extraordinarily disruptive roles of technology, I think you get 98% of the explanation for why globalism has failed and why you have Trump. Which means that if you get rid of Trump, the idea that suddenly this will go back to normal is insane. Because Trump is not the cause. Trump is the symptom. He is the result of these baseline causes, right? That's how globalism has failed. Now, before I move on to some of the current issues that are sort of dominating news today, I should mention, especially since I'm here at the Japan Society, what's the major exception to this populism? I think you all know, right? Anyone? Japan. Japan. I mean, if you look at Japan, there's no populism driving apart people in Japan, ripping apart society. Why not? We'll go through my four things. It's pretty obvious. Number one, right, hollowing out the middle and working class. No, Japan's population is shrinking really fast. There's no Japanese growth, but per capita, they're doing awesome, right? Number two, anti-immigration. No immigration. Not an issue in Japan. I mean, you don't hate like immigrants, you hate like George. One guy, right? Number three, anti-military interventions. The Japanese are constitutionally forbidden for engaging in the forever wars. Remember I think you sent a few hundred, the Japanese, to Iraq, to a place called Samawa, which you've never heard of if you're not Japanese. You know why? Because there's no fighting in Samawa. No fighting near Samawa. They're like, what's the one place we can send troops to that there'll be absolutely no chance anything will happen to them? That's where they sent them. So, smart, right? And then fourth, what? The tech, of course. Not only is the idea of displacement of labor welcomed by the Japanese because they need more labor, and if that can come from an automated seal that is furry and that can take care of 90-year-olds that are God bless the automated seal. That's a damn cute automated seal. Makes noises and stuff. You don't need dogs, no muss, hypoallergenic. It's awesome, right? But not only that, you know how many Japanese adults are on social media? 39%. It's the lowest percentage in the developed world. That's a good thing. Social media is a horrible thing for democracy. We know this. I mean, social media, the human beings are being productized by the companies so that they can sell our eyeballs, our data, to the advertisers. That is obviously a good model for the shareholders of the social media companies. It is obviously an enormously subversive model for civic nationalism and values and community. And by the way, the most popular Japanese social media site, Newspicks, right? I believe, who I know pretty well, the guy that runs it. It's very interesting to me. It's kind of a funny story because, it's all, how many of you are on Newspicks in Japan? A few, not many. It's a fair number. I am, believe it or not. They translate my stuff in Japanese, kind of fun. But, Newspicks is not like Facebook. It's not like Twitter. It's not like where you're putting forward an idealized version of yourself. It's a whole bunch of people that are making comments on other people's content, and you become a pro picker if you do really great comments on other people's content that then gets voted to the top. By the way, no anonymity. Everyone has got a verified account. It's who they actually are. He came to the U.S. and bought Quartz. You guys know Quartz, the site? Where the idea was to come up with a social media site in the U.S. that was like Newspicks so we could have more community and less animosity and vitriol in U.S. media. Except when I met with him a few months ago after he bought it, he said, yeah, nobody in the U.S. wants to use social media that way. So it's not working, right? So, I mean, the point of all of this is not just to say Japan is awesome. The point of this is to say the reason that Japan is an exception is fundamentally not exportable to the United States and Europe. It's kind of the exception that proves the rule. Japan has other problems in the sense that you are in a region of the world that is increasingly geopolitically very challenging. We in the United States are in a region of the world that is not at all geopolitically challenging, so we don't feel the urgency of responding to problems like refugees, forced migration, arms races, terrorism, you name it. I mean, how much of that gets to the US? When Merkel accepted 1 million refugees, she expected Obama was going to do something. And she was in tears, I was told by Christine Lagarde, in tears when Obama was like, yeah, that's great that you're doing that. I'm not doing that. Why would I do that, right? Because that's not popular in the United States. Obama took very few refugees, Trump even fewer, but not a priority for the United States. So, I mean, you have the social stability domestically, you have the resilience, you don't have the failure of globalism in Japan, but you have so much more of the geopolitical tensions and challenges that the Japanese are not actually well capable of responding to. The Americans are much more capable of responding to the big geopolitical challenges, but have very little interest increasingly in doing so. And that is one of the big challenges we have in the world today. So if that is the failure of globalism, if that is the us versus them problem, what's the other problem? What else do we have to deal with globally? The other thing we have to deal with globally is the fact that at the same time that we are seeing a delegitimization of our political institutions in the West, at the same time that that's happening, we also have the rise of China not embracing liberal democracy or a free market economy. For the last 30 years, the presumption in the West is as China became wealthy, as they became a middle-income economy, they would become more like the United States. That has not happened. That's a real problem for the Americans and the Europeans because we're not prepared to accept China as a country we want to work closely with unless they accept our values. We are prepared to give them more responsibility and accountability in a US-led system, but we are not prepared to compromise on rule-making. We're not prepared to sit down with the Chinese and say, okay, let's together figure out how to create new institutions where you'll be a part of the creation, we'll be a part of the creation. I was just in Munich, and one of the things that disturbed me most about that trip is that the entire foreign policy establishment in the US and Europe, to a man, and they are almost all older men, believed that as Trump is gone, whether it's in 2 years or from their perspective, hopefully not 6, that at that point we would be able to return to business as before, a US-led global system. Now, the Americans largely believe that because we're the exceptional power. We're, of course, much more capable than everybody else. That's just, we have the best values. That's the way it should be. The Europeans largely believe that because it is entirely too uncomfortable for them to think about what they would do if that wasn't true, right? But the point is that both groups of people really believe that. There is nothing geopolitically that I believe is more wrong than that perspective. Nothing. The U.S. is not, in my view, the U.S. is not in decline. There are things about the U.S. that is truly becoming more problematic. There are other things that are not. I mentioned the geopolitical environment. You look at our energy production. You certainly look at our technology production. You look at our food production. You look at the importance of the U.S. dollar as global reserve currency. I do not believe the U.S. is in structural decline. I could point to certain things like lack of infrastructure investment, education, healthcare, and say that we are. Other places I would say we're not. But I do believe that America's influence globally is clearly in very strong and sharp structural decline. One reason for that is that, as I just mentioned, a lot of Americans don't want to do the things that we have historically globally. Another reason is our allies, the Europeans, don't, and they're also much more divided. The transatlantic relationship is much weaker. A third reason is that the Russians are in decline, but they're really angry about it, largely at us, and as a consequence, they're doing everything they can to undermine our position in the international environment, both domestically, internationally, across Europe, and our allies. And the fourth reason is that the Chinese are not in decline by a long margin, and they're building an alternative. So here's something I worry about, because I think we have a maximum of 5 years. And I've not really talked about this publicly yet, but coming on the back of Munich, I think it's important. A maximum of 5 years where we have to decide, are we prepared not just to tell the Chinese the things that we want them to change, stop stealing intellectual property and things like that, but also here are the places that we are prepared truly to sit down and create a new global order with you, responding to climate change, for example. Development, for example, not the IMF model, not the One Belt, One Road model, but we both put $50 billion into a fund and say, here are 10 countries that are not top US national interests, not top China national interests, and we together are going to invest and together are going to figure out the rules by which these countries will develop, what the metrics are, how their sponsors are, how they pay, and the rest. I don't know anyone right now in US in authority in the Democratic Republican Party that would be willing to consider that. I know almost no one on the European side. But if we don't, and again, it might be too late already, but if we don't, we're going to end up in a fragmented global order with the Americans and Chinese at the very best in a Cold War. That's where we're heading. That's where we're heading right now. That's very clear. And by the way, it is not clear to me that a Cold War is the wrong thing for the global order. If we think about what China represents, its relationship with technology, its relationship with human values, certainly the lack of civic structure on the back of the Cultural Revolution, there are reasons to believe that we should have a Cold War or worse with China. We should want to win. But I really don't think we should back into that unknowing. In other words, if what we want is a global competition with China where we want to win, that should be an active strategic decision by the Americans and our allies. It is not that. Right now, it is a presumption that, no, of course China will never be that kind of a threat because China's a poor country and they can only steal things and they don't know how to develop things. And as a consequence, we can rebuild with our allies after Trump is gone, take a few-year hiatus, it'll be fine. And we're going to end up in a world that is vastly more confrontational. The Soviet Union and the US, enormously confrontational, but they were never a fundamental economic or technology threat to the things that made America great unless we had a war. With China, it's going to be vastly more challenging than that. And their economy will be significantly bigger than ours. And they will be able to pick off countries that are aligned to the United States because they can write big checks as a state, as opposed to the Americans who are doing it with companies in a diffuse way. It's not like we're going to embrace industrial policy together with Facebook and Amazon and Google. Companies that have no interest in doing that whatsoever, as Jared Kushner put to me, are not patriotic, right? So I am deeply concerned about where the US-China relationship is heading. Now, interestingly, I am not deeply concerned about where Trump and Xi Jinping are heading. I feel quite confident that we will not have a move to 25% tariffs on March 1. I feel quite confident that Trump and Xi Jinping, for different reasons but overlapping, will work very hard to announce a deal. And that deal will include the Chinese buying soybeans and LNG, and we'll have some Chinese promises on not ripping off IP anymore, most of which they won't actually pay attention to. But there'll be some real announcements that the Americans will be able to tout as significant. I think that's going to happen. The likelihood that that actually improves the trajectory of US-China relations and all these other areas is zero. And I think that should worry us. So in this very unusual geopolitical environment right now where there's not all that much that is urgent, right? I mean, Iran, we pull out of the deal, but the Iranians are still holding up their end of the bargain, as are the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians, everyone else, right? So if their economy is getting hit pretty badly because of the American sanctions, but 2019, is Iran going to blow up? I don't think so. We're going to have war with the Israelis or the US? I personally don't think so. North Korea, fire and fury. Now we've got a second summit in Vietnam. That going to blow up? I don't think so, right? I mean, Trump and Xi Jinping, at the very least, are on a stable trajectory, while the South Koreans and the Chinese are doing much more with the North Koreans than they were historically. The Americans are becoming a more marginal player to the outcome, that's true, but it's not going to blow up. US-China, as I mentioned, Trump, Xi Jinping, not going to blow up. The market headlines will be fairly benign, actually. I can keep going, but I think we all know that structurally, the wheels are coming off the geopolitical environment. And they're coming off both bottom up because of the delegitimization of liberal democratic institutions across the entire West, with the exception of Japan, and top down because of the unwind of the geopolitical order coming from the changes in the transatlantic relationship, Russia and China. It is really unfortunate that those two things are happening at the same time. It makes it much harder to address. I mean, the whole populism phenomenon would be a lot easier to respond to if it was happening in the early 90s, where America and its allies were kind of the only game in town. Dealing with the Chinese, both upside and downside, would be a lot easier if you had a lot of cohesion inside the United States and Europe, and also across the transatlantic relationship. And the thing that really worries me going forward is not that we're going to crash tomorrow, it's rather that we don't have the resilience to respond to major shocks when they occur. So if you want to think about, and we'll go to questions, right? We'll just open up right after this last thing I'll say. By the way, many questions, we have a lot of time for questions, so anything you want to go is fair game. You know, again, I didn't cover the whole world. I will do my best in Q&A. If you think about the last two things, the last two major crises that hit the United States and were global in impact, think about 9/11, think about 2008 financial crisis, think about what happened. After 9/11, the whole country came together, Dems and Republicans. Bush, 92% approval ratings on the back of that. That was global. That was across the whole U.S., believe it or not. 3 months after 9/11, January 2002, he was at 92%. Not only that, but massive support from the coalition of the willing, dozens of countries around the world supporting the U.S. to go after the Taliban, to get bin Laden, right? And not only our allies, but even the Russians opening bases in Central Asia for the U.S. to use for supply chain. That's a big deal. After 2008, the Bush response, the Obama response, rowing in the same direction. TARP, bailouts, banks, Detroit. The country wanted to do everything possible to avoid a depression. And not just the U.S., but our allies also, all trying to engage in stimulus and speak from the same hymn sheet. Even the Chinese, not our allies, recognized at that G20 meeting in London back in April 2009 that it was important to show that we were together, there was consensus. There ain't no way the next time we have a major crisis, whatever it is, pandemic, cyber attack, terrorism, or the next major economic slowdown, you're not going to see that kind of coherence and consensus in our own country. You're not going to see it with our allies, and you're sure as hell not going to see it with our adversaries. And that worries me. And I say all this to you as someone who is pretty upbeat. A lot of you, I know, have seen me before, both here and other places. I consider myself not a Dr. Doom type guy. There are a lot of great things happening in the world right now. We can talk about those too. But I happen to be an expert in the geopolitics. And unfortunately, the geopolitics right now of the world are heading in a much more dangerous direction. And so that's kind of where we are. And I'm delighted you all came out in the snow. I appreciate that. I hope you found this worthwhile. And now we'll have a chance to have a little discussion. So looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bremmer. I know you want me to call you Ian.
I do, yeah.
Ian.
Thank you.
I lived in Japan for over 10 years, so it's very hard for me to call people by their first name still. All right, Ian. Ian it is. All right, I'll ask you a question first, and then we have so many people here today, so I'd like to go right ahead and open up the floor for questions from the guests in our audience. So you talked about the geopolitical challenges between the US and China. You touched upon that. Since we're at the Japan Society, I'd like to ask you about Japan. The international environment is challenging also for Japan. How can the country navigate that?
It's hard, right? Because, you know, the fact is that Japan has, what I should say, Asia. China is increasingly the dominant economic player for pretty much everyone in Asia. They are increasingly the dominant military player in Asia. And if you're Japan and you are the aircraft carrier for the United States in Asia and you operate under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, and you've got all these historic and cultural animosities with the Chinese and they're reciprocal, how do you manage that? Now, I think there are lots of ways that the Japanese and the Chinese can and should work together, because it's not like the Chinese and Japanese are going to be competing very hard for scarce resources. Japanese population is shrinking. Rather, the Japanese economy has many things that the Chinese need. You know, you have a system where you actually are able to deliver efficient health care for an incredibly elderly society. The Chinese need more of that. You have incredible infrastructure. The Chinese need more of that. You have an incredible service society. The Chinese don't know they need more of that, but they really do need more of that. And you know, despite the fact that Prime Minister Abe is knee-jerk negatively disposed towards China, his trip to Beijing a few months ago, which not only brought a hell of a lot of CEOs to try to improve business relations, but also talked about developing joint agreements into Belt and Road, where the Japanese would bring their better management, their transparency, their you know, sort of more advanced execution capabilities in these projects, together with the Chinese in infrastructure. That strikes me as a very positive thing. But for the Japanese are simply going to have a much harder time hedging with the Chinese than other countries out there. And their inclination will be increasingly to do things like, you know, engage with the Germans on cyber and keep Huawei out. And if the United States and China are heading towards true confrontation, and again, right now we are, then there's no question that is massive downside for Japan over the course of the next 5 years. It's dangerous for the Japanese to be in that position.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to open up the floor now. I saw that hand, the gentleman in the back with the black jacket. There are microphones on either side. Is it possible to pass the microphone down? Thank you. If you could state your name and your question.
Sure. My name is Omar, and I have a quick question, Ian. Thank you for coming in, on institutions. So we historically here in the United States had a really world-renowned State Department. We had a world-renowned military, as well as a functional Congress. How would you rate those three today? Because we're seeing a lot more, I would say, discontent in the State Department. The military, I think one of the chiefs basically wasn't informed about Syria. Any color on that would be amazing.
Well, the fact that the military wasn't informed on something doesn't mean they're not capable. It just means they weren't informed. And I do believe that the military in the United States, and we obviously spend more on our military than the next, I believe it's 8 countries combined in the world today. China's coming up quickly, and a lot of countries are increasing their defense spend. But there's no question in terms of combat readiness, in terms of global reach, no one is remotely close to the U.S. Now, asymmetric military capabilities are increasingly causing problems for the United States. So I think in terms of cyber attacks, for example, the Russians today are largely at parity with the U.S. And if you talk to people in the National Security Agency, they will admit that. That is a problem for the Americans. But, you know, ability to actually get boots on the ground or, you know, project drone strength and all the rest, no one's close to the United States. State Department. Some good news is that, I mean, it's from a low base, but Rex Tillerson was certainly the most disastrous Secretary of State for morale inside that department that I had ever experienced. Morale under Pompeo is dramatically better. He is a good manager, right? Something he's had from previous iterations in life. He's actually someone that knows how to work politically and knows his way around a large bureaucracy that doesn't work very well. ExxonMobil under Rex Tillerson was an incredibly well-oiled machine, and Rex was God. Very different with the kind of the differentiated constituency working you need to do if you're Pompeo. Now, there is no question that the U.S. State Department has lost an awful lot of capable and qualified men and women, especially in the senior ranks, over the last 2 years. Massive depletion. The key career diplomats, that designation, which is the most important professional, most of them are over 50% have left. We haven't been able to replace them. You know that a lot of ambassadors haven't been appointed. You know a lot of undersecretary and assistant secretary positions haven't get appointed. And also, it's less attractive as a job for people coming out of masters. At NYU, they have an annual State Department, what do you want to call it? Like job fair thing, information session. 10 years ago, they used to get 200-300 people for it, and there was standing room only, and people couldn't get in the room. And this year it was like 40. I mean, it's not where you want to go to work, right? And that's really depressing. The Brits have gone through that over the last 25 years. The U.S. is going through that now. It's very interesting. I told you that the United States has this, what's the term? We've lost all of our career diplomats and stuff. I told you that the foreign policy environment, the never-Trumpers were Democrats and Republicans. So Trump, you may have heard, refuses to allow any never-Trumpers in. Said, if you were never-Trump, you can't come in. And this frustrates Pompeo immensely because almost anyone talented that's in the foreign policy establishment is never-Trump, right? So, but what he's done, and it's very interesting, is Pompeo, instead of doing the assistant secretaries, the undersecretaries that require Senate confirmation, he's started creating a bunch of special envoy designates who are people that would have gotten those jobs for things like Venezuela and the Korean Peninsula and whatnot, and they are never-Trumpers. Like he just put Elliot Abrams in for Venezuela, who's a never-Trumper. And Pompeo actually privately said that the way he told Trump at the end of a briefing, he's like, oh, by the way, I've got this guy and I've got him in as a special envoy. I said, but don't worry, it's not Senate confirmed. Because the thing that real reason Trump didn't want never-Trumpers is because he didn't want them to be on the stand and have one of the Democrat senators bring up a quote when the guy said something that he was vastly opposed to Trump, and then he would have to answer it and get embarrassed to be embarrassing for Trump in the media. So if you don't have them Senate confirmed, he doesn't mind them coming in. So you are starting to staff at least a few of these positions. The third one you asked was? It was the State Department, military, and Congress. Oh, Congress. Yeah, Congress is a disaster. I mean, but it's not that there aren't enormously smart people working in Congress. It's just that the place has become so incredibly polarized that there is very little scope to work on functional cross-party legislation. So you can't do big things anymore. You can't do, I mean, the idea of a Marshall Plan. I mean, the Chinese are all around the world writing checks. Countries respond to that. They might prefer to work with the Americans, but there is no functional alternative, and Congress can't get that passed. So we're legislating by executive order, started in a big way by Obama. Trump comes in, he rips them all up. Next president comes in, they rip up everything Trump said. That's no way to run the ship, right? So no, Congress has become vastly more dysfunctional.
All right. Okay, next. So many hands. Oh, I saw the blue shirt first, the gentleman in the blue shirt. Yes, with the blue striped tie. Yep. If you would like, please state your name and your affiliation. Thank you.
My name is Jigar Khatri. I'm with the CFA Institute, and the question that I wanted to ask Ian was what his thoughts are on the recent INF withdrawal and what he thinks the long-term geopolitical consequences of that will be, particularly with respect to America's relationship with Russia and China.
I mean, the fact that the U.S. pulled out of the INF with effectively no real consultation with the Europeans, like the withdrawal from Syria announcement, withdrawal from Afghanistan, those were the reasons why Merkel came out publicly so heavy-hitting against the United States, against the collapse of the world order, against Trump personally. That relationship is badly broken at a personal level. I do believe that the Russians were in breach of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and Obama said that, and many Europeans said that, but they wanted to find ways to nudge them and pressure them as opposed to just ripping up the deal. Now, the deal's not ripped up yet. We said we're going to leave this 6 months before we formally leave, so in principle, you could have a change of heart from Trump. In principle, the Russians could decide they're going to actually come into compliance. Neither of those things will happen. We will pull out. They will pull out. And what that means is that you will end up with those forces then staged, and it's not because of China, by the way, because while the INF Treaty does not cover China, it only covers land-based forces, which means, and anyone you talk to in the U.S. military says that the Americans can counter Chinese developments with sea-based forces in Asia. So there was never an issue there. And it's so interesting to see the Chinese say, we want multilateralism. And they say this publicly. And then you say, well, oh, but you mean like on the INF Treaty? And it's like, oh, no, that's sovereignty. So, no. What it means is that over the course of the coming 5 to 10 years, we're going to end up with forward deployments that reduce deterrence, reduce reaction time to accidents, and make the European continent and the world a little bit more dangerous. It doesn't, in the near term, it doesn't really dramatically affect the strategic balance, and even in the long term, it's only at the margins, but it's clearly a bad thing to pull out of. Yeah.
Okay, next question from this side. The gentleman in the gray sweater, the gray jumper.
Hi, my name's Utkarsh. I'm a student at NYU. So I have two questions. One's about domestic politics in America, and the other one's geopolitical. The domestic politics one is knowing that already 12 Democrats have announced that they're going to run for president, and there's independent candidate Howard Schultz. So Trump is going to have all the time he needs as the incumbent to concentrate on his base about a year before the election, while Democrats are going to fight for the nomination. And so do you think that's going to give him enough time to concentrate on that 30% of America that is so pro-Trump that allowed him to get elected in 2016? And my second question is about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is that it's supposed to be a replica of the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, which was like the geo-economic strategy of America to indebt the world to itself and then allow an American world order. So do you think China will be successful enough to indebt all these third world countries who can't pay their debt, which China knows, to take over these infrastructure projects such as Sri Lanka or Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan and create a new world order?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the big story there was Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, where the Sri Lankans couldn't pay off the terms, and so the Chinese ended up with the equity position, and now they control a big port. But there are better stories. The port of Piraeus in Greece, actually, the Chinese finished that on time to specifications, created a lot of jobs, and now they're building out the urban area around Piraeus. While in Thessaloniki, it was supposed to be a French project. They brought in a Russian oligarch. It was a disaster. There were Greek Americans that came in for another port. They promised all sorts of things, and then they end up 2 years later not being able to raise the money. Your views of China really, there's a lot of diversity in how they've handled these things. And also in some countries where, governance is much worse, the Chinese play down to your level to a much greater degree. The DRC, for example, Zimbabwe, for example. And then, of course, you also have elections. In Malaysia, you've got, a new government comes in. They say the old government was very corrupt in the way they handled all this stuff, and now they're, potentially causing real trouble for a major rail line that the Chinese wanted to invest in. We'll see where it goes. Look, I don't think that, if you ask me how are the Chinese doing compared to the Americans in the Marshall Plan, you'd probably give them like a C-. But that's not the comparison. It's how are the Chinese doing compared to nothing? And the answer is awesome. Like if you're Nigeria or you're Peru and the Chinese as a government's coming in saying we'll build this infrastructure for you and no one else is going to do it, you're going to pick China. And so many leaders I've talked to around the world have talked about the fact that of course they're going with China because no one else is doing it. The Americans have the Build Act. It's nice. It's tiny. I don't know what to think about 2020 in terms of who I would handicap yet. Demographics are tilting towards the Democrats. More Hispanics, more blacks, 1.5 million felons in Florida that can now vote. All that tilts towards the Democrats. That was a referendum that just passed in Florida a few months ago. On the other hand, when Trump is going one-on-one, his ability to change the rules to favor him politically as opposed to whoever the other candidate is, I wouldn't discount that. But the one thing I would pay attention to for 2020 that I don't see people paying attention to, and I'm worried about it, is that the Russians are going to be involved in this election. The way they were in 2016, the way they are in the European parliamentary elections right now. But in 2016, we found out late, Obama wasn't running, and no one really did anything about it. Didn't become a huge story until after the elections. 2020, it is super politicized. You're going to have members of the intelligence community that are going to be saying in testimony to the Democrats that the Russians are trying to delegitimize the election. And they're going to say that we need to do certain things to ensure its sanctity, which Trump will not do, which means that it's going to need to go to the courts. I mean, it even raises the possibility of the Democrats arguing that we would need to delay the election in order to be able to ensure that it was free and fair. Now, I'm not suggesting that's going to happen. I'm saying that if you think 2016 was a divisive election, you have seen nothing compared to 2020. And I believe that the fight over this election, the sanctity and legitimization of the election and what Trump is going to say, is actually much more important to watch than the Mueller investigations. Because the Mueller investigations, whatever happens, ultimately, the impeachment is a political vote. It's not about arresting Trump. So it's a really big story with nothing on the conclusion. Where the election story is, and the Russia, a really big story with an election at the end. And I don't see anyone really talking about this yet, but I promise you we're going to be in 2020. That for me is the big issue coming down the pipe. Yeah.
All right. Okay, great. There's so many questions, so we're going to do a little game, right?
Yes.
What did you call it? The lightning
round.
Lightning round.
Lightning round.
So the rule is ask the question in one sentence, and I guess you're going to answer as short as you can.
And then I'll get to all of them.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, because we only have a few more minutes left. Yes, in the red sweater. The gentleman in the red sweater there.
Which means you have to be really fast with the mics.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, be fast with the...
Can you discuss 5 years from now what a potential U.S.-China Cold War might look like? Thank you.
It will.
Very short, Ian. Very short.
First, it will fragment the global internet, and countries that are aligned with China, that are most aligned with China economically, will end up having their technology systems, their data systems, which means that you will increasingly not have a single global marketplace for lots of companies that right now presume that you do. That's the first way to play it.
All right, gentleman in the front here, second row, cardigan, gray cardigan. And I'll get to some people towards the back. Okay, I'll get you. I've seen you from the beginning. Sorry about that. Okay, go ahead.
All right, I'm Zach Dykewald. I'm the author of Young China. With America's retreat from Asia, what do you expect for the creation of other legal opportunities or legal entities that China might be leading in the area?
I expect those entities are going to become de facto the rule makers in lots of spaces. I mean, obviously they are increasingly in China itself, but there'll be many countries, not just weak ones, like Cambodia, or Laos, which the Chinese control, but some big ones. I think about countries like the Philippines, and over 5-10 years, maybe even countries like South Korea, where you'll see some dominant Chinese standards being set. I think that's very interesting.
Okay, the gentleman in the back there with the glasses.
Real quick, Abe nominates Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Your thoughts?
Abe isn't saying that he did, but...
Fairly easy thing to do for Abe to make Trump happier. Remember this, he was the first one to come visit Trump after he won the election, brought the golf clubs, saw the family, said how wonderful he was. This was the international equivalent of that.
Okay, the lady in the down jacket with the glasses, second row.
Thank you. How do we support more women to become global leaders?
Yeah, I mean, education. The fact that women are now increasingly getting educated as the world gets more urbanized, especially in the developing world, I think is a game changer. Mm-hmm. And you see it happening. Younger generation has different views in many countries about gender relations than older generations do. but it's taking an awful lot longer than I think most of us would like it to.
Why is that, do you think?
Because for most people in power, changing gender relations is a box-checking exercise.
I see. All right, next question. Oh, there's so many. Oh, what should I do? What should I do? All right, I'm going to go back and then come back to the front, okay? The lady with the necklace, the white necklace.
Ian, what is the one geopolitical issue that keeps you most awake at night?
I sleep really well. No, if you read my Twitter feed, Trump doesn't keep me awake, this stuff. I don't. I mean, I think it's so extraordinary. I'm an existential optimist. It's amazing that we're even alive, that we can experience this. When you think about it, you're like, how is this even possible, right? I think in the near term, the thing I worry most about would be a Russian cyber attack that gets out of control, like what they did to Ukraine with NotPetya, that caused billions of dollars of damage outside Ukraine. Near term, the single thing I would worry most about would be something like that, but that would affect U.S. critical infrastructure and how we respond to that.
All right, maybe two more questions. Sure, yeah. The gentleman in the front with the green sweater, and then we'll take somebody from the middle row next.
Steve Garcia, retired veteran, 32 years. 75% of my career was in Japan. Question is, it's not that you have to worry about Russia, but you have to worry about Iran in terms of cyber attack. But how do you see China in terms of they play their own games? How do you see a World War III?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Russia because I do believe that they are so much more risk acceptant than the Chinese. So the Russians have a combination of capabilities and willingness to use them. The Chinese have vastly more power as a country, but because they're not in decline, they feel like the world is moving towards them. And so they're much less willing. I mean, they want a more stable world order that's incrementally shifting in China's favor. Russia wants to directly undermine the US-led order. But how I would envisage a World War III would be that the debate, I'll tell you, if the Americans and Chinese end up truly in a technology-driven Cold War, at some point there is a plausibility that either the Americans or the Chinese would have a breakthrough that would create an extraordinary first-mover advantage. The technological equivalent of when the Americans developed the nuclear bomb, right? Quantum computing might be a piece of that because quantum computing would render all cryptography efforts obsolete. If we were to know that the Chinese were about to make a massive breakthrough in quantum, or vice versa, the political leaders of that country that would be on the receiving end would almost have an obligation to engage in a preemptive strike to stop them from developing that. Now, obviously, you would hope that that would be done in a way and communicated in a way that would avoid incredible escalation, but clearly that's also an environment where you might get that sort of escalation, and that's how you blow ourselves up.
And I'm sorry, Ian's already working overtime. Just one final question. I'm so sorry. I have to choose one of you. And I did see the lady in the moss green sweater raise her hand earlier. So last question. I'm very sorry.
Thank you so much. Ian, where do you see Venezuela politically in 12 months?
Okay, and then bring the mic down to Mr. Perella because the chairman of the board actually showed up for this whole damn thing, and it's his house. He's allowed to ask the last question.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Perella. Did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah. Venezuela.
Yes, go ahead.
So, look, Venezuela is the one place that we can really say that the United States under Trump is leading a large multilateral coalition. Most of our allies around the world, even the Canadians, are supporting us. Mexico is the only major ally of note that isn't on board. And behind the scenes, the Russians are working with the UN and talking to some Europeans about can we get a political compromise, maybe find a way for Maduro to leave, but the military still to be in charge. The Chinese, meanwhile, have met with the opposition, because the Chinese don't care who runs the country. They just want to make sure that they keep getting their money, right? I think that there is a better than even chance that this ends without extraordinary violence, or should I say more extraordinary violence that's already been rested upon the Venezuelan people. But it's dangerous. And if we don't find a way to get Maduro out, and that probably requires more than military deterrence, so he feels like he really has to, or it's going to get much worse for him. And the willingness of the Venezuelan military to actually use violence on the people is pretty high. The average Venezuelan has lost 24 pounds of weight in the last couple of years. This is not the South Beach diet. Those are the other Venezuelans. That's the first time I ever used that. I don't know if it was going to go over. You know, it's a very serious problem, and it's a dangerous one. And we've had 3 million refugees that have come from Venezuela, and it's affecting a lot of countries in the region: Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Chile, even. It's dangerous. So I do worry about it. But I can't say that Trump has mishandled it so far. I really can't. Really can't. I hope that he does not actually think he has a military option, because that would not be good. But generally speaking, he's got everyone with him right now. Yeah.
And Mr. Perella, you had a question.
Thank you. Trump came out against TPP. Hillary was first for it, then against it. Is it dead forever, or and what are the implications of that?
I mean, certainly if Amy Klobuchar were to win the nomination and win the presidency, she'd be in favor of it. Certainly, if Mike Bloomberg, however implausibly, were to get the nomination, he's certainly favored. I've spoken to him about it. I'm sure you have too. But you have to get it through Congress, and the willingness of this Congress to pass a major trade deal that did not have significant tweaks, I think, is very low. So, I mean, I think that the TPP 11, the countries that are signatories, would all very much welcome the Americans to still get on board. I do think that there are other things that we have pulled out of that in a Democratic presidency, or even a non-Trump Republican presidency, which isn't happening this time around but could in the future, you can get back in. So, you know, for example, Paris Climate Accord, U.S. next president, right back in. Iranian deal. Pompeo privately admits that if Trump doesn't get a second term, U.S. goes back in the Iran deal, and everything's as it was. They fail in their strategy. So a lot of the stuff that Trump has done is not sort of forever. They're the foreign policy equivalents of executive orders. But TPP was one that even Hillary, I think, and she was one of the architects of TPP, but had she won, she was going to have to make some material changes beyond just the cosmetic to actually get it through Congress. And I'm not sure. I mean, you talk to Jake Sullivan, he's like, we have a plan, we can get this done. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And of course, I mean, you know, what I sense is behind your question, which is certainly my view, is that the single biggest foreign policy strategic mistake the Americans have made was to pull out of TPP. Because if you are heading towards confrontation with China, you desperately need it to be a multilateral effort. And we've really, really made it hard to do that. That's a big own goal. You know, I'll end with this. If you're the United States, right, you're the world's most powerful superpower. The awesome thing about being in our position is that no one can do the kind of damage to ourselves, to us, that we can do to ourselves, right? That's an awesome thing. It's also a really unfortunate thing, because we have really done that, right, on a number of occasions. And certainly you look at 2008, but certainly look at things like, you know, Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and Iraq and Afghanistan, the overreaction to 9/11. And now you look at Trump and America First and TPP and all those things. We are shooting an awful lot of own goals that I don't believe put America, again, in a position of inexorable decline, but help to ensure that the next world order is not an American world order. And it is sad to say that, because we've all, I think, benefited from the American-led global order, and it's gone. It is gone. Thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you very much for your closing comments, Mr. Ian Bremmer. Make sure you check out Ian's book, Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism. And if you have time, do join us on the first floor for refreshments and some time to chat. We'll have some time to chat. Thank you very much for staying longer than we agreed on. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. A big applause for Mr. Ian Bremmer. You can follow him on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter @Ian Bremmer.